I recently finished my doctoral program here at RPI, and sort of looking back on the experiences I've had, I wanted to sort of come back to UNT and share some of those things that I've learned along my own journey. And hopefully the focus for today will be on individuals, any questions that people might have, and then we can go from there. So the real webinar-y kind of content that I have is going to be relatively short. And I'm just going to focus on some of the major differences between undergraduate and graduate programs. There's a large difference of philosophy that for people who are interested in beginning a graduate program in the sciences and engineering, these sort of shifts in philosophy can be quite jarring if you don't know that they're coming. So one of the first major differences that I want to talk about is that when you apply for undergraduate programs, it's typically an admissions department at the university that makes those decisions. When you apply for graduate programs, however, it's the faculty of that department that makes those decisions. And this seems like a trivial difference, but there's actually a number of consequences to this. So for example, when it comes to particularly your statements in the application, typically the faculty that are reading your applications are not as interested in things like extracurricular activities and other sort of holistic things that look great on a resume. But for a graduate program application, these things can tend to muddle the message that you want to send to the program. Things like any research training on specific equipment or specific assays or experiments, coursework that you've participated in, any relevant job experiences that you might have had, and in particular your research experience. These are things that you'd like to focus on more in an application. There are some differences here between a master's program versus a doctoral program when it comes to these philosophies. For master's programs in particular, I would say more often than not, a master's program is not necessarily going to be research focused. These are typically thesis track programs. So when you're applying to these programs, the coursework that you've participated in is among the most, is among the most important factors when it comes to entering these programs. For doctoral programs, however, it's your research training, your research accomplishments, your academic achievements that sort of reign more important, along with a general goodness of fit for the program or the department that you're looking to begin your program with. A big point of the philosophy difference between undergraduate and doctoral programs in particular is that you should know that a funded PhD student, you would be paid for teaching classes, whether it's a TA or taking on full coursework requirements, performing research and preparing publications, both review papers and research publications. So in that sense, you should think of the doctoral program as truly being a full-time job, in that you have very direct responsibilities that you should be taking care of while you're in the program, because a doctoral program is not just about coursework. So when you're writing to apply for such a program, the faculty are really interested in turning you into a colleague and a future collaborator. And by putting you through their department and their program, they'd like to see you become an ambassador for that department. So the department's success is really dependent upon your success. So when you apply to these programs, these are the things that faculty are going to be looking at. And so these are the types of things that you should focus on in your applications. The second major difference that I want to highlight for today is that undergraduate degrees are typically only fulfilled by coursework, although it's more and more common nowadays, particularly in undergraduate engineering programs, although increasingly in science programs as well, that you might have outside experiences be a part of the degree requirements as well. For example, co-op experiences at companies that are participating in the field. Master's programs, particularly those that are a thesis track, really mostly focus on coursework for 1 to 3 years, unless there is some research focus, and that might take a little bit of that time. However, a doctoral program only focuses on the coursework portion of the degree for the first 1 or 2 years of the program for meeting the coursework requirements. After that, it's all about research. So when it comes to the coursework, I know that can be a very intimidating part of starting a doctoral program in particular. You might have noticed from my introduction that in my own undergraduate training, I have bachelor's degrees in chemistry and biochemistry, and then I went on to graduate school in chemical engineering. So moving from the sciences into engineering is actually a pretty large shift in coursework expectations, and even just the way of thinking about problems is very different. So if you're considering entering a program that's different from what you studied as an undergraduate, don't be intimidated by some of the remedial stuff that you might have to do once you enter the program. These things might include having to take on a little bit extra coursework or having to take some classes with the undergraduates in that department to sort of get you up to speed. But just remember that if the faculty have admitted you in as a doctoral student, they're highly invested in your success. So the remedial stuff is all about broadening your base of expertise. But more than that, not just getting you to the level of everyone else in the program, but your alternate experience, your alternate perspective. For example, mine coming from the sciences going into engineering, my training as a scientist can give me a unique perspective compared to my colleagues who might have done their bachelor's degree programs in engineering and therefore have a different mindset in the way that they solve problems. When you're entering a program that might be different from what you're familiar with, these are the types of advantages that you could look forward to. So don't be intimidated by looking into programs that might be different from what you studied. In fact, moving from a bachelor's degree program into graduate school, it's really a perfect opportunity to explore more of the academic things that interest you. Another major difference is that there's sort of a mindset in high school and in undergraduate programs. Typically, once you go to that first day colloquium with all the other freshmen, you're sort of welcomed as the class of 2000 whatever. And so everyone feels sort of bound to that timeline, which for many people can lead to a lot of stress. And there's lots of examples out there of saying that even 6 years is, perfectly normal amount of time that it takes to finish an undergraduate degree. But that aside, when you are in a graduate program, you're really no longer bound to these types of expectations when it comes to class of 2000 whatever, for example. You get the degree when you earn the degree. So therefore, there's really no rush to finish your program, especially when you're not bound by coursework. So you should really be focusing on the quality of your work once you're in the program, and not be bound by anxieties induced by having to finish by a certain time. That's really irrelevant, and it's really about the output of your work. If it's high quality and ready to be put out into the world, then you're very ready to finish that program. While you're in the midst of the program, you should also be taking a lot of time to network and spend time at regional, national, and international conferences, because these people are your present colleagues, your future colleagues, And they're just as interested in you as furthering the field. So while you're in graduate school and taking the time to put out some high quality work, this is also a great time to expand your network and learn the skills that it takes to do those networking activities. A couple of things that frequently come up when it comes to discussions in graduate school is this phenomenon called imposter syndrome. This is a very, very common experience. It's generally a feeling of not deserving your place in the program, among other anxieties. The bottom line is that you are deserving, whether you feel like it or not. You're in the program, you're just as deserving as anyone else to be there. Having said that, there is certainly a crisis of mental health among graduate students in this country. And there are many resources out there to help with that, but it does take a little bit of proactiveness to sort of nip that in the bud before it becomes a major problem. But this is something that I would feel remiss to not mention if somebody is interested in graduate school. I think this is something that is important. Undergraduate programs, coming back to the philosophy of a graduate program, undergraduate degrees are typically group focused. And by that, I mean, you're going through classes and everyone goes through as a cohort. But in graduate school, the focus is really just on you. Now for the coursework portions of your degree, you'll be going through as a cohort. But because you're gonna have a lot of independence in the work that you're doing, it does take some getting used to in those first couple of years. You have to sort of find a new workflow and find a new stride in getting work done and knowing what it takes to get work done when you have all this independence. This is something that can also be jarring for people who are going straight into graduate school from an undergraduate program. And finally, I want to make a couple of notes about the way that graduate programs are funded. Typically, these are in the form of TA assignments. This is being a teaching assistant, a research assistant, or in various fellowships and grants. When you're first starting a program, i.e. when you're an undergraduate applying for graduate programs, things like fellowships are a huge point of leverage that you could have when applying to graduate school or making contacts at departments that you're interested in. If you are able to secure your own funding through fellowships, then this gives you a lot of leverage to a department wanting to further their investment in you as a participant in their program. So as an undergraduate, it makes a world of difference to take some time to learn what the various funding opportunities are and how you can use that to leverage your graduate school experience. So all in all, there's a number of philosophical differences between undergraduate programs and graduate programs in the sciences and engineering. I think these differences can be quite jarring because I don't think in a typical course of an undergraduate program, these types of things are not necessarily touched on in the coursework that you're taking as an undergrad. And so a number of things you sort of have to either figure out on your own, or you get there, you start the degree, and things just happen and you cope with it as you go. So with that, I'd just like to open it up. If anyone has questions about the graduate school process in science and engineering in general, whether you're seeking advice for applications or clarification on what it's like to go through a program, what it's like to participate in research, or even about my own experience moving from UNT to RPI. So with that, I'm more than happy to take any questions that people might have.
Hey, Cliff. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us, or I guess doing the Zoom chat. I was wondering why you chose to get a master's before your PhD.
Sure. So that's a good question, and that actually that's a topic I meant to bring up. I went straight from bachelor's degree to PhD program. In other words, I did not apply for a master's degree at all. It just sort of happened along the way. A lot of times, the way that programs are structured in the sciences and engineering is that you start off the program and the first major, let's say, obstacle that you need to overcome is your qualifying exams. So this is sort of the first obstacle of demonstrating your undergraduate expertise in the coursework. Now, for example, in my own department of chemical and biological engineering at RPI, the qualifying exams were completely coursework focused. So there, in the chemical engineering program, there were sort of 4 major focuses. And so faculty write 4 major questions and you answer them just like an exam. For mine, took me about 4 hours to complete. And then they assess your responses to the questions and determine if you've passed your qualifying exam. That's sort of the first hurdle. The next hurdle is candidacy. So once when you enter graduate school, you are a graduate student. When you pass your candidacy exam, you are a doctoral candidate. And there's a big difference between those terminologies. So you go, again, from graduate student to doctoral candidate. And it's typically at that point, once you become a doctoral candidate, that a lot of these master's level things sort of kick in. Because by the time you've become a doctoral candidate, you will have completed all of the essential coursework that's required of your doctoral program. And in most places, certainly all the places that I've happened to look into, but probably in most cases, the requirements of passing your candidacy will include having gone through the amount of coursework that a master's student will have gone through anyway if they were in that program. So just by virtue of going through the doctoral degree, you're also sort of getting the master's degree along the way. Now, what a lot of people will do, if you're going from a bachelor's degree in field X and you're going for your doctoral degree in field X, in other words, the same field, some people don't find it necessary or even want to get a master's degree along the way because there was no change in field. So the master's degree is in a sense irrelevant once you have completed the doctoral program from that same department in the same degree. So for me, although I went straight from bachelor's program to PhD program and along the way happened to get a master's degree. But for me, I felt it was important to get the master's degree along the way because I did switch from chemistry/biochemistry into chemical engineering. So a way of getting around that imposter syndrome that I mentioned, this was a big part of it for me, was getting this master's degree to have that tangible sense of validation of having moved from one field into another and having that sense of belonging so that I could have the confidence to finish my doctoral work. So to finally answer your question, in a lot of cases, if you enter straight into a doctoral program from a bachelor's degree, which is not an uncommon thing to do at all. So you shouldn't feel like you have to get a master's degree first and then do a PhD. I would say in many, if not most cases in the sciences and engineering, you typically apply for a PhD once you finish your bachelor's degree. That's the typical flow. But from there, the decision to get the master's degree is typically just a couple of extra forms of paperwork that you submit to your department once you have completed those requirements anyway. So for example, when I was going through my candidacy exam, I had to write this very large thesis anyway, which is my candidacy document. And it just so happened that, the 130 whatever pages that I had written for this candidacy exam, that was basically a master's thesis all on its own. So I said, well, hey, why not? I've already, written this thesis. I've already done the coursework. I'm just going to submit the form to get a master's degree because it will help me have that sense of validation. But there's certainly no requirement to get the master's degree along the way. And certainly some people don't, they don't feel like they need to, or it's just not their goal or their focus. So yeah, for me, it was something that happened along the way, not necessarily the goal from the start. So yeah, thank you. That was a good question.
I have a question about the NSF GRF. So my field is neuroscience, and I will graduate in May and go into a post-bac program doing research, but the goal is to get a PhD in neuroscience. And I'm very interested in applying for the graduate research fellowship. But upon looking at, all of the stuff that would go into an application and what would be competitive, I'm not sure like when that might be the best time to apply. Mm-hmm. And also, when do you know that you're qualified to apply? Is my question.
So when I went through the NSF GRFP process, and by the way, I went through that process twice. The first time I applied as an undergrad for my first year of graduate school. That application was not successful. It was not funded. And then I applied again in my first year of graduate school, and that time it was successful. So the way that the program worked back then was that there were basically 3 different pools of applicants. There was an undergraduate pool of applicants. There was the first year grad school applicants, and then there was the second year pool of applicants. And the strategies of writing the applications for each one were a little bit different. But now, from what I know, the focus has shifted to now that there's the undergraduate pool of applicants, which I think is fairly all normalized because everyone's in their last year of undergraduate. But then there's, after that, there's just the general graduate school pool of applicants. And I think, Dr. Duban, if I'm saying anything incorrect, please jump in. But because of that shift between having the 2 different graduate pools into now just having the one pool, let's say you apply as a first year graduate student to the NSF GRFP. Well, at that point, you might not have as much experience or research acumen as somebody who might be a year ahead of you. So if you're in the situation where you're a first year graduate student, then yeah, you might want to hold off until you can make a really compelling scientific story. As an undergraduate, though, I don't think you necessarily have that restriction, or not really a restriction, but you don't really have that added challenge of having to compete with those who are further along in a program than you. So I think the rules are that you can apply once as an undergraduate, and then if not successful, then you can apply once as a graduate student. So I think the best way to take advantage of that would be to apply once as an undergrad and then again as a graduate student. When it comes to the content of the application, this would be an entire webinar all on its own. Strategies for successfully winning the NSF GRFP. But in short, a lot of this is really the same advice that I give for general applications as well. So again, the people who will be reading those applications are more focused on your training, your coursework, and your experience, especially your research experience. So when it comes to these sort of holistic and well-roundedness factors that one might put into a personal statement, sometimes those can just take up page space that could be better occupied by research experience space instead. So a lot of this general advice that I give for graduate school focuses on applications. A lot of that's transferable to NSF GRFP as well. So my general advice is to keep the story focused on what you're doing in research. Even though it might be called a personal statement, it's really your personal story of you as a researcher, not necessarily you as a person. So I think that's the major thing to be cognizant of when preparing for these types of competitions. So hopefully I answered your question. Is there anything I could add further to that?
No, that was great. Thank you so much.
Great question. Okay, I see in the chat that somebody mentioned, let's see, I'm not seeing a notification on Twitter. So if you feel comfortable putting in the chat, please feel free to do that as well. So while this question is coming in, if anyone else has any questions as well, I'm happy to answer them.
Well, Clifford, let me go ahead and ask you about the criteria that you use to choose a graduate program. You mentioned the admission process being very different between graduate and undergraduate. And I guess what you look at as a prospective student is also pretty different.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a helpful reflection for all to hear.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. So I can give you sort of my own personal anecdote on that. So when I was looking for a graduate program to apply to, I was focused on faculty who were doing things that at the time I thought were really interesting. A lot of that legwork was kind of difficult to do because then you're crawling through department websites hoping that faculty had uploaded recent research, and not everyone does. So sometimes that leads to a lot of dead ends. But the way I went about it was knowing a general field that I was interested in, and then sort of keying those keywords in and seeing which names happen to come up a lot in that field. So for example, when I was a fourth year, or I should say when I was a senior at UNT looking to start and find a graduate program, I knew that I was really interested in the fields of metabolic engineering and synthetic biology, which are inherently multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary fields. So there wasn't really a clear-cut answer for me on what type of, number one, what type of department I should be looking at, but then even further, what faculty are doing that type of work. These questions become pretty difficult to answer. So coming from the perspective of metabolic engineering / synthetic biology, these are things that are that are influenced by chemistry, biochemistry, chemical engineering, biomedical engineering. So that was sort of my first informed step in the process, was narrowing it down to what types of departments might happen to host the type of research I'm interested in. So I was looking at things like departments of chemistry, departments of biology, departments of chemical engineering. So that was sort of one layer of figuring out where to go. The next layer was looking at some of the primary research literature, looking at topics with the help of my research advisors. Because not everyone can comfortably navigate the confusing world of academic literature. But using those keywords to find some names in the field that publish often, publish recently, and publish about things that I thought were cool. So I was able to make sort of a short list of names of people that kept coming up. And then from there, I can see, okay, where do they teach? What programs are they a part of? And so for me, that narrowed it down to a couple of different universities. Then from there, you can apply your typical, geographic and cultural things that you would filter to pick a part of the country or elsewhere that you'd be happy living while studying. And of course, that's going to filter out a couple of those schools that you landed on in the previous step. And then from there, ideally, you'll have landed on, I don't know, maybe on the order of 10 universities and programs that you're interested in applying to. And then from there, it's a matter of putting in all the applications and all the things that I've already mentioned. So to answer the question, it's a really individualized process, because you really have to think about what do I, as a researcher or a future researcher or somebody in this field, what am I really interested in? What programs best serve those interests? Who is working in the field that I would want to network with? And what schools are big names in those fields? So these are all factors that play into how to make the decisions of where to look for submitting these applications.
Great answer, thank you.
So I see an additional question in the chat. Let's see. So how would you recommend standing out on a grad school application? And how would you recommend finding research experience as an undergrad and standing out on NSF REUs? Okay, these are all good questions. So let me just take them one by one. For standing out on a graduate school application, I've worked personally with, I would say, probably 15 undergraduate researchers in my own lab at RPI. So I've seen a number of undergraduates who had varying degrees of interest in graduate school, and I sort of helped them navigate through. And of course, these are all questions that they have as well. So fortunately, I can sort of address these. To stand out, so the reason that I knew these students to begin with was because they were working with me in a research capacity. So I think first and foremost for science and engineering programs, it's your research experience and acumen that are going to be the number one thing that helps you stand out. I think increasingly graduate programs are more or less expecting students to have that research experience, and more so than just serving as a lab technician, but really having a say in the direction of a project, and the creative thinking around a project, and problem solving a project. These are the things, the types of things that will really, really stand out for graduate school applications. And everything I'm saying is also applicable for any of the NSF processes like REUs and the GRFP. So when you are participating as an undergraduate researcher, you should really advocate for yourself to have a larger say in the direction that a project's going. Now, of course, the professor that you're working with and the graduate students that are in there likely have already hammered out, the major components of any given project, given that these projects are funded by by grant agencies and federal agencies and other funding bodies. So in most cases, these projects are not necessarily completely flexible. However, within that framework, you're certainly able to make some of the smaller decisions, like would this assay be better suited for answering this question, or would that assay be better suited? Would this computer program for analyzing data help me answer this question more so than the current program that the lab is using? Sort of exploring these types of questions adds to the research experience because it shows that you can think independently, and having that demonstration of independent thought. For me, looking at the undergraduates that I've worked with over the past several years, it's that ability to think independently that I think is absolutely crucial. So speaking as somebody who has mentored these undergraduate researchers for years now, I highly value an undergraduate that can problem solve, because it's inevitable, and I should even say expected, that things are going to go wrong on a daily basis in your lab work and your experiments. Things will go wrong. That's the nature of science and engineering. So it's that reframing of failure can really also help with the mental health and imposter syndrome aspect of that as well. But the independent thought that goes into problem solving, for me as someone who's mentored many undergraduates, to me, that stood out the most. So were I to read an application from somebody who can demonstrate their process of independent thinking versus somebody that can only really say, I think I can do this. If somebody can demonstrate it, that will really stand out. So I think pretty much all of that is applicable toward things like the REU programs and the GRP programs. I can't speak a lot to the REU application process, simply because I'm not familiar with the total application process. Number one, I didn't do an REU myself at UNT. In fact, UNT hosts REUs, so I didn't go through that process. But having said that, I did directly mentor a handful of REUs that came to RPI in my time here. And a lot of these same things that I've mentioned apply to them as well. Now for REUs, the amount of time that you're spending on a project is probably much, much shorter than an undergraduate who has more of a permanent fixture in a lab. So the REU process is probably a bit more accelerated. So in that sense, again, having the written demonstration of your ability to think independently would probably help your application stand out a lot more. Now, given that in some cases, applicants to REU programs might not have as much access to laboratory, hands-on laboratory experience as some others, I think there's also a couple of other ways that you can stand out on these things. For example, can you go into the primary literature and think critically about what people have written? Can you compare experiments between different publications? You can say, well, group A looked at this problem and came to this conclusion. Group B looked at the same problem and came to a different conclusion. Well, why do they have different conclusions? Are they mutually exclusive? Do they support each other? Even just being able to identify these things in the literature and talk about them, that shows a high degree of independent thought that will also help you stand out on these things. And then the final part of this question, how to find research experience as an undergrad. This is certainly a difficult problem. And every university is going to have different systems in place for doing this. Now, UNT being a very large university might have some standardized resources that might be department specific. at RPI, we're a pretty small school. So word of mouth has a bit more traction here than in a large university. The undergraduates that made it into my lab that I ended up working with, all of them made their way to me by emailing the professor that I work for and sending along their resume and a couple of sentences about what interests that student has about that professor's research. So this is where sort of crawling through department and faculty websites to see what they're working on, that's where this becomes a lot more important. So if you can familiarize yourself with some of the faculty that you might be interested in working with, look at the work that they've done recently, and look at the work that they've done in the past, and ask yourself, does any of this excite me? And if so, what about it excites me? And let the faculty member know that. You can say, hey, I've looked a little bit through the work you've done, and I find this really exciting. Well, that's going to stand out a lot to a faculty member to have this undergraduate reach out to them and to be excited about their work. That faculty is probably much more likely to, if they have the space for it, offer an opportunity to that student. So there might be some more standardized systems in place depending upon the university. But from my own experience here at RPI, all of the students that I worked with came to me or ended up with me as a result of having reached out directly to the professor, stating their interests, sending their resume and their transcript. And then it just sort of goes from there. And one other note that I'll add to this is that there's a lot of fear of rejection when it comes to stuff like this. But again, it's that reframing of failure that I think is really crucial here. Because let's say, I'm just going to make up a number. Let's say, only 10% of undergraduates that reach out for positions get them. That's a completely made up number. I'm just using it as a demonstration purpose. Well, if you just look at it for what it is, 10% sounds extremely low. But all that means is that if you reach out to more faculty, then statistically you're going to increase your chances of getting a positive response. So be willing to keep an open mind about what type of research experiences you could have. Maybe don't just focus on one person when you could focus on 4, just by matter of statistics. If you want to look at it that way, reaching out to more people will certainly increase your chances of getting a positive response. Okay, so let me look through the chat here. Undergraduate GPA. Okay, so what can I say about undergraduate GPA and the graduate school process? So what I can say personally is that it's not as important as you might have an intuition of it being. Not that it's not important at all. I mean, there are thresholds that departments require, and it's going to be different for every department that you look into. But the absolute value of the GPA is actually not that critical. And again, it's because, especially if you're going into a PhD program, it's all about independent thought and research. What can you do as opposed to what courses have you taken? Now, of course, that the coursework plays some role, but the demonstration of independent thought is really what's much, much more important. So yes, you should meet the threshold, but in those statements, if there's a problem spot in your transcript somewhere, it's perfectly fine to point that out and say, hey, I realize this doesn't look so great, but it was because of XYZ or whatever. Faculty might be more amenable to, seeing that you're willing to put in the work to, do something remedial about that. If they see that you can self-identify problem spots, that can actually work out a lot in your favor. So, again, reframe failure, turn the problem spot into into an advantage for yourself. There are many ways to reframe challenges. So yeah, to answer the question, I would say the undergrad GPA is not as important as you might think it is. Okay. So I've caught up with all the questions in the chat and caught up with Twitter. So looks like we're all caught up with questions. So if anyone has any other questions that they'd like to get out there, I don't know what the time limit on this meeting is, but it looks like we're approaching an hour. But if anyone else has any further questions, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, hey Cliff, this is Dr. Dubin.
Hello.
Great presentation, just wonderful. Could you add a few words about broader impacts as those affect an application for an NSF GRF? And
yes.
the advice you have given to students who are applying for the NSF GRF?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And when it comes to broader impacts, there's really, there's broader impacts A and there's broader impacts B, or at least that's the way I think about it. And they really are two different topics. Broader impacts A, for the purposes of this discussion, are the broader impacts of your research on society or towards a specific problem or toward a specific industry. You know, as a result of going through this research, how will that impact society? How will that impact product development? You know, these very tangible things. And then there's what I consider the second part of that. So broader impacts B, which is much more about you as an individual. More like, I, as a scientist, am I able to, at some point, eventually reach back and help other people move forward? What communities will my success help to impact? For example, one of the things that I've written about were my challenges with my socioeconomic status growing up. And so by virtue of having made it through, you know, these number of programs, I can say that as a future faculty member, I know exactly what it's like to go through these challenges. So I am able to reach out to these students and have an impact on them and helping them through this process. And that's just one example. One of my past undergraduate students, she is now at University of Pennsylvania. She's a graduate student there now. But when she was writing her application for UPenn, she had a similar question on her application, which was about these broader impacts. And she was is a ChineseAmerican, and she's a woman. And so on those bases, we were able to find some research in the literature that gives some statistical credence to an underrepresentation of Chinese American women in academia. And so from that perspective of being a part of that community, her success can help lead to further success from people in that same community. Another example, I helped a fellow graduate student in my lab prepare for his NSF GRFP application. And an example of broader impacts that he wrote about was that he saw a lot of impact of poverty where he went to college. He saw that some students in his classes were really struggling with things as a result of not having access to certain resources or not having had access to those resources in high school and even earlier. So he was able to say something about wanting to sort of reach back and help pull those people forward. So all of these things I've mentioned, these fall within what I consider the second type of broader impacts, which is in addition to, what does my research, how does that impact society? But the other part being, what impacts will I have on other people who want to get into the field or the people that are in the field? What can I contribute as an individual? And so the things that I wrote about in my own GRFP were experiences with gender and sexual minorities. And that was one of the bigger things I wrote about when it comes to broader impacts, helping pull those underrepresented groups forward. And I was able to actually have some forward action on that. While at RPI, I was able to put together some conferences on professional development for LGBTQ people, and helping other underrepresented groups connect with each other. So these are all examples of things that are wonderful to put into an application for broader impacts, and what I think are crucial and critical for these things.
No, thank you for that response. Thank you.
Great question. So I see we're all caught up in the chat, and we're all caught up on Twitter. So yeah, if there are no further questions, I want to thank you all for joining me. It's a real pleasure to be able to connect with some people from my alma mater, hopefully help a few of you go forward. I've been there, a couple of other people in this session have been there as well. So I'm really glad that some of you are looking forward to the graduate school process and getting there. And it's a process, but it's a worthwhile process, and it's a very rewarding process. So I will share my contact information with Miranda afterward. And anyone who would like to reach out to me on a personal basis, you're completely welcome to, whether it be through Twitter or email. I can share that information.